You're watching Jim Cantelon Today Television. This is Bible Study for the 21st century. Welcome again, friends. Always good to come your way, and I love it when you're there too. I can't see you, you can see me. You remember the old Romper Room show where the gal who was hosting Romper Room would hold up this mirror that had no glass in it, but she'd look through it. I see Becky, and I see Jimmy, and I see Alvin, and kids would love it because it meant that she saw them. Well, I don't see you, but I can see you with my mind. We'll be back right after this.
The Bible tells us that true religion is visiting orphans and widows in their distress. The Bible also says that God is a father to the fatherless and a defender of widows. Heaven's core values for mankind begin with God's heart for the least of these. When you support WOW, you're in the sweet spot of God's heart for the poor. Yes, we're only a small player in this great drama, but at least we're on the field. Please give generously.
Today, we get to the most famous parable of all the parables Jesus taught. And you know which one it is. It's the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, the parable of the prodigal son is right up there too. But in terms of, popularity is the wrong word, but I think in terms of reference, the Good Samaritan is number one. Let's pick it up here in verse 29 of Luke chapter 10. We dealt with this last week, where the scribe says to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" This is after a discussion of what we call the great commandment, to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus answers and says, "A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, who stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a certain priest came down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise a Levite, when he arrived at the place, came and looked and passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. So he went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and he set him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, when he departed, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I come again, I'll repay you.' So, which of these 3 do you think was neighbor to him who fell among the thieves?" And he said, "He who showed mercy on him." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." Okay. There's really no need to rehearse this parable. It's the most famous of all. It teaches us that love is indiscriminate and is often catalyzed by compassion. If we can help our neighbor in his need, we fulfill the call of justice. I am my neighbor, and my neighbor is me. Okay. Nevertheless, it's good to be apprised of the huge racial and cultural gap that there was between Jew and Samaritan in Jesus' day. The city of Samaria was built by Omri, O-M-R-I. He was king of Israel in 870 BC. You can read about that in 1 Kings chapter 16. It became Israel's capital. And as you know, from the time of Solomon, or the time of Solomon's death, when Rehoboam, his son, took over, you had a division. And you had Israel in the north, you had Judah in the south. And so you had the king of Israel and you had the king of Judah, and that prevailed for a long time. Anyway, in 722 BC, Samaria, the city, was besieged and taken after 3 years by the king of Assyria, whose name was Shalmaneser. That's in 2 Kings chapter 17. And he quickly deported about 30,000 Israelites to Assyria, Syria, north of Israel, repopulating Samaria with foreigners, Gentiles, from exotic sounding places like Cutha, Babylon, Hamath, and other foreign nations. And these foreigners adopted a kind of syncretistic form of the Israelite religion. So the Jewish view was that at best, Samaritans were half-breeds and their religion was a heresy. Syncretism, you know what that means. That means to blend. You take an element of idolatry, you take an element of the worship of God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you take an element of this, you take an element of that, and you put them all together. That's called syncretism. And of course, for the Jew, it was a total heresy. On the other hand, the Samaritans held that the Assyrian deportation in 722 was merely partial. They said many Israelites stayed in Samaria, and the exiles returned after 55 years. So, we've got lots of pure blood here. So they said. They claimed to be descendants of those Israelites who stayed. But, and this is a big but, they believed that Moses had designated Mount Gerizim, which is in Samaria, as the chosen place for the worship of God. You can read about that in Deuteronomy 27. In their view, the temple in Jerusalem was bogus. Bogus. Both Jew and Samaritan saw each other then as inferior. Samaritans are inferior because they worship on Gerizim. Jews are inferior because they worship on Mount Zion. There was obviously no love lost between them. And so when Jesus told the inquiring scribe about a good Samaritan, the crowd of listeners would have uttered more than a few sub voce epithets, you can be sure. Now, there are about 400 Samaritans in Israel today. They still conduct the Passover on Mount Gerizim every spring. My wife and I attended one of these ceremonies a few years ago, and here's my memory of it. And I'm going to refer to a text of a sermon I preached at a prominent pastor's funeral. So you'll see me looking down a bit here because I want to just stay on text. Back in 1983, the Ministry of Tourism in Israel invited Kathy and me and our partners in ministry there, Wayne and Ann Hilsden, to attend the Samaritan Passover on Mount Gerizim near Nablus, Israel. This Passover ceremony has been celebrated throughout eons of time. It is the most authentic insight into Old Testament sacrificial practices that exist today. And we were honored to be invited to this closed ritual, intrigued at what we might experience. It was a cold and windy late afternoon on Mount Gerizim. The wind was blowing with such force that many of the Samaritans and invited guests leaned into the blast, their faces covered with scarves against the cold. And as they walked up to the sacrificial site on a small table of land at the top of the mountain, they were freezing, they were shivering. Set on the rocky soil was a small enclosure. Gathered within were the last remaining Samaritans on earth, 400 strong. Next to the enclosure were 12 deep pits with blazing fires in each. And as we guests gathered around the enclosure, we saw to our wonder that each Samaritan family had a lamb. And such lambs, perfectly groomed, as spotless and pristine as if they'd been fashioned by the Creator at that moment. Each lamb had beautiful red roses woven into its wool. I'd never seen that before. It was a breathtaking sight, it really was. And the lamb nearest to us was so close that I shyly reached over the short fence and stroked its wool. And the Samaritan father, holding it on a leash of multicolored braided cord, looked at me and smiled. In broken English, he said, "Welcome to our day of salvation." Each of the Samaritan families with their lambs stood silently in the enclosure, and they were waiting for the sun to set. It was already descending over the Jezreel Valley to the north, and we could see Mount Tabor on the horizon. And between us and Tabor, we could see the distant town of Nazareth in the fading light. In 2 minutes, the sun would set. Just then, 2 burly young Samaritan men left the enclosure and walked over to a small white hut standing about 50 meters away, and they knocked on the door, and out came a stooped old man, clothed in white, his long white beard and hair blowing in the wind, and this was the Samaritan high priest. The young men half carried him over to a large rock that stood on the edge of the mountaintop. They lifted him up on the rock and then joined him there. Like Aaron and Hur holding up Moses' arms during the battle with the Amalekites, they held the high priest's arms to heaven. And he stood silent until the sun disappeared over the horizon. And then, in a quavery voice, barely audible over the rushing wind, he intoned a prayer, and every eye was on him. When he had finished, the young men carried him back to his little hut, and as they did so, we turned our heads back to the enclosure, and to our shock, every lamb lay dead on the ground, their blood already soaking into the earth, and not a sound had been made. No protest, just silent death. Then there appeared to be a small commotion in the midst of the 400 Samaritans. Suddenly the 2 young men who had lifted the priest onto the rock lifted a baby, clothed like the priest and flowing white. They lifted him high above the crowd. And as they did so, the Samaritans broke out in spontaneous, prayerful song. And as the young men turned in our direction, we were stunned and amazed to see lamb's blood smeared on the baby's forehead. The deep meaning of this struck us immediately. Here was symbolized new beginnings, salvation, new birth. Innocence had trumped sinfulness. The nation of the Samaritans was born again. The mystery of the 12 blazing pits was made clear. Each lamb was butchered and roasted in these pits, and every last morsel had to be eaten before midnight. And in the early starlit morning, the Samaritans, and we were with them, descended Gerizim, and they had been washed clean by the blood of the Lamb. What a picture. What a picture. In all of my days in ministry, and I've been in full-time ministry now for almost 52 years, that is one of the highlight moments of my life. To see there right in front of us, if you will, an historic manifestation of the reality that the book of Hebrews is so strong on. Without the shedding of blood, there's no remission of sin. Reminded that the Lamb, Jesus, the Lamb of God, takes away the sin of the world on Calvary's tree. Powerful. I'll be back.
Assure you from the inside it is happening. God is our hope. God is all we believe in, this God. And he has called us to be the repairers of wars and to take care of the widow and the orphan in their time of need. And that is exactly what we do. Lives are changing. Why? Because Jesus is Lord. And why? Because Christians have come together as a body. The united body of Christ is coming and saying, it stops with this generation. We break it and we move on.
The kind of religion that God endorses is to care for orphans and widows in their distress, justice, and to keep oneself unpolluted from the world, righteousness.
So now, after having taken you to the Samaritan Passover, I need to go back to the parable of the Good Samaritan. When this scribe says, "Who is my neighbor?" Jesus tells him this parable. Let's just go through it. This man, he says, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, that's verse 30, and fell among thieves, who stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, departed, leaving him half dead. I can really see this in my mind's eye, because the road from Jerusalem to Jericho was a road that I traveled every week for 7 years, because I was going down to the Jordan Valley, meeting it at Jericho, and then driving up the Jordan Valley to the Sea of Galilee, around the west coast of the Sea of Galilee, through Tiberias, to the north where Capernaum is, up the Mount of Beatitudes, and then up into the upper Galilee, all the way to the northern border, to the northernmost city or town in Israel called Metula, where with my military pass, I would then go through the military gate in my little Volkswagen to an abandoned customs house in southern Lebanon that had been converted into a humble radio station. And there I would do 2 shifts a week, broadcasting country and Western music, the gospel, news and weather, to southern Lebanon and northern Israel. What an experience. I did it for 7 years. So I know the road from Jerusalem to Jericho really well. I could almost drive it with my eyes shut. Back in Jesus' time, it wasn't the kind of road it is now. It was just a winding, almost goat path. And believe me, there's all kinds of goat paths still there. And most of them are precipitously, on the side of these Judean desert hills that absolutely surround that part of Jerusalem. So it was a very rigorous up and down. Jericho's down on the level of the Dead Sea. So we're talking here 1,500 feet below sea level. And Jerusalem is about 3,000 plus feet above sea level. So this is way, 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 way down, okay? There's caves, there's valleys, or they're called wadis. All kinds of opportunity for highway robbers to hide and then attack those who went by carrying goods and services to Jerusalem. And all kinds of, small businessmen and traders and so on would be taking that route every day. Also climbing up from the Jordan Valley to Jerusalem, and also descending from Jerusalem back down, would be men, priests and Levites, who were on their way up to the temple for their week of service. 1 week a month they were on duty. And so they might live in Jericho, or they might live in some of the other parts of the Jordan Valley, or even in the Galilee. And they would have to walk up to Jerusalem or ride their donkey to Jerusalem to do their temple service. Here you have the story. It's a parable, but believe me, Jesus' audience could relate to this. This guy, he's on his way up to Jerusalem, and he falls among thieves. King James Version is so quaint. He fell among thieves, and they attacked him. They wounded him, I think probably trying to kill him. They stole whatever he had of value, and then they escaped, leaving him there bleeding and dying on the road. So what happens? A certain priest comes down that road. Now it says he came down that road. So he was probably coming back from Jerusalem. He'd done his week of temple service, all right? He can hardly wait to get home to his wife and his kids in his own bed. And he sees this guy, and he gathers his robes around him. Whoa, poor guy. And walks past him real quick. He doesn't want to get involved. Okay. Then a Levite. Now, a Levite was essentially a servant to the priest. The Levites had a lot of responsibility. Sometimes they could do very significant things in the worship culture. But generally, in the pecking order, or the hierarchy of the religious culture of Israel, you had priests and then you had Levites. And Levites basically were there to serve the priests and to serve the people by serving the priests, okay? And doing some, like, for instance, there were times when there were tens of thousands, It's hard to believe. Just read about the dedication of the temple when Solomon dedicated it. Tens of thousands of lambs that were sacrificed at the temple. Well, who would do all of that killing and that butchering? The Levites. Okay, who would manage, the some of the business dealings under the Sadducean management? The Levites. Okay? The Levites were grunt guys. So this Levite, and Jesus doesn't say whether he's going or coming, but he comes by, and he does what the priest did. He just walks by on the other side. And then the Samaritan comes by. Now, remember what I said? Samaritans and Jews despised one another. This would be, if we were to put this story in a modern context, this is an Israeli who's dying on the road, and a Palestinian from Gaza walks by. That's basically the shock value of the parable of the Good Samaritan. And he sees the guy and has compassion on him. He gets off his donkey and he pours in oil and wine, which, are still very effective when it comes to wounds, until such time as you can get them to the emergency department. I had a friend one time who had a very serious hunting accident. He was just in his teens, and his father was with him, and his father had some cooking oil with him because they were doing some camping, and he just poured it in the wound, and he puts pressure on it, and he took his 16-year-old son on his back, if you can believe it, and carried him 3 miles out of the bush to the car, and then to the hospital, and he lived. But oil and wine, good stuff for wounds. Sets him on his own donkey, brings him to an inn, and took care of him. Now, if you've been to Israel on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, you go past this building that's called the Good Samaritan Inn. It's not the Good Samaritan Inn, but it may be located where the Good Samaritan Inn was in Jesus' time. It's interesting, from that point, sort of halfway down between Jerusalem and Jericho, you can actually look up from where the inn is up to Jerusalem, and you see the skyline of the back of the Mount of Olives on the horizon. It's quite a stunning sight. Then you turn and look this way, and you can see down to the Dead Sea and the Jordan Valley, where Jericho is located. It's a beautiful spot. Anyhow, he says to the innkeeper, look, I have to carry on with my business, but here's some money. You look after him, and if there's anything other than this 2 denarii that is spent, I'll be good for it when I return. And it's obvious that the innkeeper knew this guy. He was a regular, all right? So he knew he could trust him. And so he looked after him. And as far as we know, the poor fellow survived. Great story, huh? So we refer even to this day to someone who does an unexpected act of service as a Good Samaritan. A lot of people have no idea the story that's based on. That's it. So he asks the scribe, okay, so you have the priest, you got the Levite, you got the Palestinian terrorist. Which of them was a neighbor to the wounded Israeli on the road? No brainer. He who showed mercy to him, the scribe says. Exactly. Go and do likewise. Now, if the scribe was typical as a religious lawyer, he would have not only been legalistic, he would have been hard on those who broke or bent the rules. And probably being human, like you and I are human, he was very quick to judge. You notice how quick we are to judge? I've been disciplining myself these last few years to just try to purge myself of being judgmental. It's almost like a reflex. We so tritely sometimes quote John 3:16 in that conversation Jesus had with Nicodemus. And after the conversation, John writes, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." We can all quote that. Very few of us can quote John 3:17. For God sent his Son into the world not to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. What's up with us and our condemnation of those who have yet to come to faith? Why should we expect anyone who's not come to faith to act as though they had? Why should we expect them to have values morally and culturally that reflect faith when they have no faith? At least they have no faith in Jesus. Why should we expect that? And why should we be so quick to judge them then? Because they're doing something that only our faith in Christ and our obedience to our Heavenly Father prevents us from doing. Judge? We've not been called to judge. We've not been called to condemn. We've been called to have a salvific, to use a big word, impact on our world, to love our neighbor as ourselves. Just like the Samaritan showed love to the Jew who was dying in the middle of the road.
Why dance when you have very little? When you live from day to day with food insecurity, rampant disease, sickness, and death? You dance because your heart is full of love for God and your hope is strong. WOW has come alongside as the hands and feet of the Lord, providing both home-based care and assurance of God's love. You're happy and you've got to dance. Please support WOW. Let's keep them dancing.
So friends, 5 years ago we started JCT TV. Some of you have been watching it that whole length of time. About a year and a half in, we changed studios, and we work now, as you know, with BibleDiscoveryTV.com. But I began writing commentaries for the program, and I made them available to you in pamphlet form, 50, 60 pages, called Cantelon's Casual Commentary. I got through Matthew and most of Mark, and then COVID hit us. During the past 14, 15 months, I wrote this, an entire book called Cantelon's Casual Commentary, a 21st Century Guide to the Life of Jesus for the Internet Generation. It's 520 pages, very heavily researched, and I write, as a pastor from Jerusalem. I really know Jesus' country. I can smell it, I can feel it, and it comes through in the book. It's a commentary that's worth the purchase. So put it in your search engine, or go to Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com and buy one today. I'll see you next time.